Hey guys, congratulations on getting one of our Tractorless Triple packs. I'm Jeff, I'm the winemaker for Tractorless Vineyard. We're based in Barrel in the Southern Highlands, so about an hour and a half to the south of Sydney, almost halfway between Sydney and Canberra. We run our vineyard all biodynamically. We run sheep through our vineyard for the entire growing period. And this means we use our tractor about 60% less. And that's where our name comes from. We're trying to be quite a sustainable label. You know, we run the sheep, got the solar, we do a lot of regenerative practices. I have this ultimate goal that one day we're going to build this winery that's completely off the grid. That's a bit in the future, but something we're working towards. So we're going to taste a few wines tonight. First off, we're going to start with our Grigio and then our Gris. Our region, quite well known for these cooler varieties. Everyone comes into our cellar door all the time asking me, what's the difference between Pinot Gris and Pinot Grigio? And so we decided we're going to make the difference. And Grigio, which is the one we're tasting first, this is the Italian way of making it. And Gris is the French way of making it. And the first big difference we actually see between the two is actually the philosophy behind the winemaking. If you think about Italian winemakers, it's all about the food. And so food is really important to them when they're making their wine. It's something they're always thinking of. And to an extent, we can say an Italian winemaker is making a wine specifically for a food. That's not exactly 100% true, but they are definitely very conscious of food when they're making wine. The French, on the other hand, the wine is all about the wine. It doesn't mean that they match any less with food, because the French Gris match beautifully with food. It just means that they're approaching the winemaking from these, I guess, two different ends of the spectrum. So we end up with these two really different styles. Think about Italy, a lot of seafood, maritime climate, a little bit warmer down there. So the Italians, they're trying to create something really fresh and zippy and crisp and steely. So when I'm making the Grigio, the first thing I do is I actually harvest it nice and early. And I'm harvesting it at what we call a Baumé level of about 11 to 12 Baumé. Now, this is a sugar level. There's a million different ways to measure sugar. There's like Oeschlers and Brixes and grams per litre and specific gravities. Look, a lot of winemakers, we like to use Baumé, because if I take one Baumé of sugar and I convert it into alcohol with a yeast, I end up with 1% alcohol. So it's just a really easy 1-for-1 ratio. So we're harvesting these grapes at about 11 to 12 Baumé, which means they end up being about 11 to 12% alcohol. So it's one of the first big differences. That's slightly earlier, slightly lower alcohol than I guess we're used to for a lot of our white wines. The next thing I do, Italians, not afraid of oxygen at all. So when I make this wine, I actually squeeze off all the juice into a tank, and then I'll fill a bucket from the bottom of the tank and I'll tip it in the top, and I'll fill it from the bottom and I'll tip it in the top. And I might do this 10, 20 times until all of that juice goes brown from the oxygen. And then I do a nice, cold, long, slow ferment. And that oxygen and that cold, slow ferment helps me do a couple of things with the Grigio. The first thing, it helps me stabilize some of the flavors in the wine. The next thing is it helps me create what we call a steely palate. And Italian Grigios are really famous for this steely palate. And what do I mean by steely palate? Well, have a look around the restaurant, find yourself a little bit of stainless steel, maybe your fork or your spoon or something, and give it a lick. And this is what I mean by a steely palate. It's kind of like a metallic-y feeling, but it's quite a clean, crisp metallic-y feeling. And the Italian Grigios are really famous for this, I guess, textual note in their Grigios. One of the things that I find really difficult with Italian Grigios, and I actually find it with a lot of Italian wines, really hard to taste in a wine tasting or a scenario where you don't really have that much time or that much food. And that's because there's a lot of hidden flavors in these wines. Now, I mentioned how we make it with that cold ferment. That stabilizes these flavors. And if you were to take that Grigio and sit it on your table for the rest of the evening, taste it with like different foods, taste it at different temperatures, what you'll find is it really changes quite a lot. And every time you look at it, oh, you'll see another flavor, oh, and another flavor and another flavor. And this is one of the things that's really difficult with Italian styles of wine, is because they really need that time and that food to show you everything they have to offer. And then when the final thing, when you taste it, nice, crisp, clean, zippy, that nice steely palate. And you get that sort of fresh apples and fresh pears, but you don't see any yeasty, cheesy characters. And one of my favorite matches with the Pinot Grigio is actually fresh oysters. And when you match it with fresh oysters, you all of a sudden get these beautiful yeasty, cheesy flavors coming out of the wine. You think, where did that come from? Because I can't taste it in the wine now, but then I match it with an oyster and I get these beautiful yeasty, cheesy characters. And it's a really good example of what these Pinot Grigios do. What we might do now is jump over to our Pinot Gris. So that one was Grigio. That's the Italian way of making it. Grigio, Italians, they harvest it early, they ferment it cold, and they use a lot of oxygen in their ferment, and they're trying to create something really zippy and crisp and fresh. The French, on the other hand, well, if you think about France, the wine is all about the wine. And most of the Pinot Gris in France is grown up in Alsace, which is on the French-German border. So it's quite a cold region. So the French, they're trying to create something that's big and round and voluptuous. So the first thing I do when I'm making this French style is I actually let it ripen another, probably about 3 or 4 weeks, until that Beaumet level is about 13 to 14. So we end up with about 13 to 14% alcohol in the Pinot Gris. And the first thing you'll notice, and you'll probably see it a lot better in your glass than mine, is that color difference. It's got a real sort of bronzy color, almost a pinky tinge to it. And that's because of that extra ripeness level. And Pinot Gris is a really interesting white grape variety. It's actually one of the only white grapes in the world that when it gets really ripe, it actually starts turning red. So when our sugar levels in the Pinot Gris get to sort of high 12s, early 13s, the skins on the berries actually start turning pink. And this is where their name comes from, because when you have all these little pink berries hanging in a bunch, and that bunch is hanging in the distance in the vineyard, from a distance, the bunches actually look grey. And the French word for grey is gris. So Pinot, because it's related to Pinot Noir and Pinot Meunier, and Gris because the bunches look grey on the grapevines. So that's the first big difference we see between Grigio and Gris, is that colour difference. The next thing, if you look really carefully at your glass, and you can give it a bit of a swirl, but you see about here, there's this rim of clear liquid on your glass, and it's dribbling back down into the wine. Now we call this the legs of the wine. And what that is everything volatile. So anything in that wine that can evaporate out at room temperature, it evaporates out. It condensates on the glass around here, and then it dribbles back down into the wine. Now this is predominantly alcohol. So the reason we don't see those legs as much in the Grigio is because it's only 11, 12%. The Gris, 13, 14%. So we see these legs. And this alcohol actually does something really interesting to the wine. If you get your glass and give it a good swirl and have a big smell, you'll probably agree with me that the Pinot Gris, it seems to be a lot more aromatic. There's a lot of fruit flavor jumping out of that glass. The interesting thing is, if I was to scientifically analyze the aromatic compounds of the Pinot Gris and the aromatic compounds of the Pinot Grigio, the Grigio's actually got loads more. And that's what's happening is, as that alcohol is evaporating out of that glass of wine, it's grabbing onto all the other flavor compounds with it and pulling it out. So when we smell it, we get hit with all those flavors all at once. And this is one of the really big differences between Pinot Grigio and Pinot Gris. Pinot Gris is kind of like, hey, look at me, this is everything I have to offer. Whereas Pinot Grigio is really shy. It'll show you a couple of flavors, Wants a change in temperature, we'll show you another couple of flavors. Wants a change in food, and we'll show you another couple of flavors. So the way these two wines actually show you their flavors is one of the really big differences between the styles. If you were to take that Pinot Gris and sit it on your table for the rest of the evening, taste it with different foods, taste it at different temperatures, it really wouldn't change that much. What you see is what you get. And then we taste the Pinot Gris. It's big, it's round, it's voluptuous. And one of the key things we're looking for in a Pinot Gris, it kind of has this viscosity, like this oily viscosity to it. And that's what we call a glycerol. And when we're making Pinot Gris, we ferment it at a much warmer temperature, so it can create these beautiful glycerols in the mouth and give us a bit more of that sort of viscousy mouthfeel. And this is one of the challenges we always have as a winemaker, because if I'm doing a really nice cold ferment, I get high aromatic compounds, but not many mouthfeel compounds. If I do a really warm ferment, I get lots of mouthfeel compounds, but not many aromatic compounds. So we're normally finding this balance, aromatics, mouthfeel, aromatics, mouthfeel, aromatics, mouthfeel. With Gris and Grigios, it's easy. We've just created two different styles. We've got the Italian style, which is all about that aromatics and less about mouthfeel. And then we've got the French style, which is all about mouthfeel and less about aromatics. But we can't have a wine without both of them. So the Italians, to try and build up that mouthfeel, what they do is they leave the dead yeast in the wine after the ferment, and we mix it and mix it and mix it. And the French call this bâtonnage. And what happens is that dead yeast breaks down and it imparts more of a savory, yeasty, cheesy character to the wine, but also gives you a bit of textural mouthfeel. The French, well, what they do to try and trap in that aromatic compounds, which they're losing with the warm ferment, is they do everything under carbon dioxide cover. So even if I'm transferring from one tank to a next or into a barrel, whatever I'm doing, I never let this wine touch oxygen. So we fill the barrel with carbon dioxide, we fill the tank with carbon dioxide, and we transfer it. And that way we're holding in as many aromatics as we can. So we end up with these two really completely different styles. Now, these two wines are from the exact same vineyard, the exact same block. The only difference is about 3-4 weeks harvest and the winemaking techniques. And it's a really great example of what the winemaker and the viticulturist can do to the final wine, because they are completely different wines, but from the same grape. So I love showing those two. One of the challenges for us here in Australia is there's no definition for Gris or Grigios. So it can be a bit of a lucky dip when you go into a bottle shop or a restaurant, because a Grigio could be a Gris could be a Grigio. Probably 9 times out of 10, I find that I call it, I guess, an Australian Gris or an Australian Grigio. It's kind of a complex Grigio or a more fresh Gris, and it sits at around about that 12.5. It probably uses a little bit more French techniques, but on a earlier ripening grape. And so around about that 12.5 Beaumay. And so we end up with a fresher style of a Pinot Gris, but it makes it really difficult for us in Australia to really work out what style we're going to get. It's starting to change a little bit. 5 years ago, if I entered a wine in a wine show, I would enter it as a wine made from a Pinot Gris grape. If I enter in a wine show now, I actually enter it as a Grigio or a Gris. And if I was to put that Grigio, for example, in a Pinot Gris class, even though it's a beautiful Grigio, it's probably a gold level Grigio, it wouldn't get any marks because it's not a Gris. And so this is starting to change. We're seeing it in the wine shows now, and over the next sort of 5 or 10 years, we'll see that filter down, and eventually we'll probably see it, if not in labeling law, in definitely some sort of marking on the bottle or labels in the future. So that's our Gris and Grigios. So we've got one more to go, which is an interesting one to end on. We call it our post-Mac Cabernet Sauvignon. And I was really lucky when I was back at uni. I think there was about, I don't know, maybe 10, under 10 people studying to be a winemaker at the time at Charles Sturt. And what it meant was I had I guess, one of our lecturers who taught us about all our wine tasting, master of wine, Nick Bulliard. And because there was about 10 of us, he could just grab a bottle from his cellar and all of us could taste it. 2 years after me, there's about 200 people doing the same course. And so he couldn't just grab a bottle from his cellar. You know, it was a bit harder to get the numbers in, that sort of thing. So I got to try some absolutely stunning wines. And Nick Bulliard, he tells this fantastic story where he was down in Adelaide and he's walking down the street of Adelaide and he just walked past this pub. And out the front of the pub was this skip bin. And he just happened to glance in the skip bin on his way past, and there's a bottle of wine at the bottom. So he's jumped in, he's pulled it out, and he's brought it into uni. It's just a little half bottle. And we cracked it open, we all tasted it. And it turned out to be a 1956 McGill's Burgundy. So the McGill vineyard is the original Penfolds vineyard before they built half of Adelaide on top of it. And so it was what would have been about a 40-year-old wine then, probably a bit older. And it was just incredible the way these funky, complex flavors of the aged wine and the fresh fruity wine came together. And it was just incredible. I mean, it reminds me a little bit. I had a flatmate at uni who was studying to be a chef. And one morning he's come out and he said, "Oh, guys, I'm making everyone French toast for breakfast." I thought, "Oh, yeah, cool. Sounds good." You know, so he's, made the toast and he's cut up these bananas and he's put the bacon on top of the bananas and a bit of maple syrup. And I'm looking at it going, bacon and maple syrup and, bananas, what the egg, what's going on here? And then I tasted it. And the way that savory and those sweet characters just worked together was just magic in my mouth. And aged, really old red wines kind of remind me of this. You get these funky, like fish sauce, composting guavas, and these really kind of funky tobacco-y characters. And then you still have some of those nice fresh fruit characters. And the way they come together is just magical. And so ever since then, I've been obsessed with wanting to make a wine that's going to age 50 to 100 years. And when you look around the world at what regions are really famous for making these beautiful, delicate reds that age for a long time. And the region that consistently comes up is Bordeaux. And the Bordelais created this technique that we call post-ferment maceration. And what it is if you get a red grape and you squeeze it, the juice and the pulp inside is actually red. Is actually white. And so to make a red wine, what we actually need to do is extract all that color from the skin. So what we do is we ferment the skins with the wine and that extracts all the color. And that ferment process, might take 3 or 4 weeks. And then we usually press them off. If we leave those skins sitting with the wine after the ferment, it's called post-ferment maceration. And that's what we use with this wine. And the reason we do it is there's 2 problems we have when we're aging a bottle of wine. The first problem is our fruit level. So imagine I have a bottle of wine and the fruit level's here. And as I age that bottle of wine, our fruit levels are slowly dropping and our savory levels are slowly increasing. And the premium drinking is kind of somewhere in the middle here where we've got this nice balance of savory and sweet. And, that might be, say, 10, 20 years. But if we want to get to 50 to 100 years, we've got to start with a really high amount of stable, savory fruit. So when it balances out up here. So that's our first problem. Our second problem is a structural problem. And when you have a really young Cabernet, it has those real edgy, chalky tannins. They kind of, they stick to the underside of your tongue there. They're really grippy and edgy. Well, those short, edgy tannins, they're actually a short chain tannin. And when we age a bottle of wine, those short chains join into a long chain. And a long chain is nice and soft and velvety. So that's one of the good things that's happening as we age a bottle of wine. So let's imagine I have a bottle of wine and in that bottle, I've got 100 short tannins. And I aged that bottle for 10 years. And, you know, those 100 tannins, they join together to 50 long tannins. And I might age it for another 10 or 20 years. And those 50 long tannins join to 25 really long tannins. So I've got 25 of these beautiful, soft, velvety tannins in that wine. The problem is 25 is not enough. And the whole structure of that wine falls apart. And it goes through a process that we call cracking up. And cracking up is a great description for it. If you've ever tried a wine that's cracked up, you know, red wine fills the mouth with all the flavor and texture. It's almost like someone has pulled it apart and you've got flavor and texture here, flavor and texture in here, and then right down the middle of this kind of zigzag of just acidy water. It's a really great description for it. So these two problems are solved by this technique of post-ferment maceration. And you imagine I've got a tank of wine sitting there. And in that tank, I've got all the skins and seeds and stems for a really long time. So we leave ours for 18 months. And so you've got thousands and thousands and thousands of these short chain tannins floating around that tank, which forces them together into a long chain tannin. So when I bottle this wine, I'm bottling it with 100 long stable tannins rather than 100 short unstable tannins. That's how this technique solves that structural problem. The fruit problem, well, I have absolutely no idea how the French figured this out the first time. Because I remember the first time we tried this technique would have been back in 2015, and we made all this Cabernet and we put it in tank and it'd be sitting on the skins there for about 3 months. And I remember coming out to the winery and taking a sample. I smelt it. And I tasted it. I thought, oh my God, I have completely ruined this wine. It's absolutely disgusting. And I started calling some winemaker friends and some mentors in the industry. Guys, have you tried this technique? Tell me about it. And they all said the exact same thing. Yes, Jeff, we tried it. We got to 3 months. It tasted terrible. We pressed it off. We put it into oak. We let it mature, and then we blended it out. Don't worry, Jeff. It ends up being fine. You can blend it out. It's not as bad as you think. So everyone in Australia was telling me to press it off. A couple of my friends in France said to me, no, Jeff, trust us. You've just got to leave it. And so I decided to leave it. And I waited 12 months, and yeah, it really wasn't that much better. And then I waited 18 months, and I could taste that those tannins had become long. It was not nice and soft and velvety, but it had no fruit flavor. It was just sort of skinsy and stemsy. And so we pressed it off and we put it into oak, and we left it in oak for 18 months. And I remember bottling this wine the first time in 2015 or 2015 vintage. So we would have bottled it in 17, I think. So I remember bottling it. I remember thinking at the time, am I doing the right thing here? Am I about to end up with pallets of wine I can't sell because it's got no fruit character at all? It's just dry and stemsy. I thought, wow, I've already started bottling. I've already got the bottles, so I may as well bottle with, I'll worry about it later. So we bottled all this wine. And it was about 18 months later, out of nowhere, there was this explosion of fruit. Unbelievable. It's really intense cassis, capsicum, tomato leaf characters in the wine. And I became really excited about this style and these techniques because it is doing what the French said it would do. For me, 2015, it was a little bit too much capsicum and a little bit too much capsicum. I wanted a little bit more cassis. And so in 2000, that was 2015, 2016, I let it ripen 2 weeks longer on the vines to try and get a bit more of that cassis flavor. When you ripen red grapes, it changes the structure of the tannins slightly. And so in 2016, the tannins were a little bit softer, and using this technique, it softened them too much. And the 2016 wine became way too soft and didn't have that structure behind it. And so we actually didn't bottle it under our Tractorless label. That was bottled under our Black Sheep label. Then 2017, I ripened it 1 week more than 15, 1 week less than 16. And I think we've really hit the nail on the head for this wine. We've got a little bit of that capsicum, a hint of mint, but definitely pushing into that more of that cassis sort of character. And I am super excited about these wines because they are doing exactly what the French said they would do. And, you know, who knows? Because I still to this day have not met anyone in Australia that's made a Cabernet 18 months on the skins the same as they do over there. I think Australia, the biggest I've met is about 6 months, and that was actually Wine Australia doing a whole lot of trials. And it's because they do it every month and then taste it and analyze it every month. And they got to that 3 month stage and it tasted terrible. And they thought, oh, we'll take it to 4 months, and it tasted terrible. And they took it to 5 months, it tasted terrible. And it tasted 6 months, they tasted terrible. So they stopped the project. And you really just have to wait for that 12 to 18 months for it to sort of polymerize out. So in 50 years' time, we can get back on one of these sessions and I'll tell you whether this experiment works, because who knows whether our tannins are the same as the French tannins and what's going to happen in the long term. But I am really excited about this wine. It is drinking beautifully now. You know, Cabernet, perfect match for those sweeter meats like lamb, and is drinking beautifully. But I can't wait for this to start developing that more savory, sort of soy saucy, fish saucy characters in the wine. So guys, that's all the wines I've got for you tonight. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope my stories weren't too long. In your packs, there's a couple of little QR codes. We'd love to see you down here in the Highlands. We've got so many great wineries. You know, we're such a tiny little region, but we've got all these award-winning wines in this little region. Only an hour and a half from Sydney, as long as you don't get the traffic. We do tastings in the vineyard. We do tasting at our cellar door here in town. We've got some great tours, sustainability. You know, everyone's talking about sustainability these days. So we really wanted to show you why we're so sustainable. So you can come out and drink wines and we can actually show you what we do in the vineyard. You're going to need gumboots at the moment because it's a little bit wet. We're the only people in the Highlands that do method traditional sparkling wine 100% in the Highlands. So I spent a couple of years with Shandon, and so I've learned the process quite well. And we actually all do it by hand in the Highlands. All our tirage, all our disgorging, everything is done here. And you can book tours to have a look at how that all happens, and we will demonstrate that all to you out at our vineyard. But guys, please tell your friends, come down to the Southern Highlands. We you know, everyone says we're in this nice new fancy region. We have been around. We've got some fantastic wines and we're so close to Sydney. So we hope to see you down here sometime soon. If you're coming down, make sure you wear a jacket. Make sure you bring some gumboots because this is the Highlands. It's not called the Highlands for nothing. See you guys later.